In this lecture, I plan to deal with the various opposition and dissent within the Macedonian army between 330 and 327 BC. And there are three incidents in particular with which we will be dealing. And these incidents involved two leading Macedonian figures, Philotas and Clytus the Black. The last was the man who had saved Alexander the Great at the Battle of the Granicus. The first is the son of Parmenio, who was the second in command of the army. And then the third individual is Callisthenes, the great-nephew of Aristotle, who had accompanied the expedition as the official historian, and was a man who was by no means noted for his modesty. In any event, these three incidents seem to underscore a wider discontent within the Macedonian army, and it may have contributed to the mutiny or the refusal to cross the Hyphasis or Bias River in 326 BC, when the army in effect rebelled, or rebel is perhaps too strong a term. A closer term would be it simply went on a sit-down strike. Now, the causes of all these three incidents were specific, and they have led to a great deal of speculation about Alexander's authority, his matter of command, as well as Alexander's personality. There are several ways to read this opposition. One is to see it as an example of Alexander's decadence, descending into too much drink. This has some verification in the ancient sources, and Alexander's fondness for heavy drinking, which was traditional at the Macedonian court. Philip was no teetotaler either. That this, in combination with Alexander's adopting of Persian dress, ceremonial, to win over the Iranian elites, that it conspired to, do in Alexander in the eyes of his Macedonians and Greeks. Several of the ancient authors dwell on this, and it goes back to a tradition in Alexander's own lifetime where Alexander was a great and noble figure done in by too much of a fondness for alcohol. That has actually led one modern scholar to argue that Alexander was, at least by the statistics of the modern age, an alcoholic, and this accounts for his behavior. And there's really very, very thin evidence to argue this, and alcoholism becomes the invisible enemy that eventually does in Alexander. Let's take two passages from the sources that are not usually favorable to Alexander. One is Diodorus Siculus, who is writing in the 1st century BC, and the other is the Roman historian Curtius Rufus. Both of them had reason to comment on Alexander's behavior in this period, and I think these two passages are extremely important because Arrian and Plutarch, the sources that are deriving much of their information from Ptolemy, tend to be more favorable towards Alexander. Now, here is Diodorus Siculus, who has information that the other three sources generally don't have. It seemed to Alexander that he had accomplished his objective, and now he held his kingdom without contest, and he began to imitate the Persian luxury and extravagant display of the kings of Asia. First, he installed ushers of the Asiatic race in his court. That's an important point, because the Macedonian king traditionally was open to any of his subjects. Macedonian nobles and even the soldiers themselves had easy access to their king. And certainly that was the manner of rule that Philip had followed. And then he, Alexander, ordered the most distinguished persons to act as his guards. Among these was Darius's brother, Oxothres. And that's an important point. The Persian nobility are actually acting as part of the ceremonial retinue of Alexander. Then he put on the Persian diadem, that is a pearl headdress, and dressed himself in the white robe and the Persian sash and everything else except the trousers and long-sleeved upper garment. He distributed to his companions cloaks with purple borders and dressed the horses in Persian harness. In addition to all this, he added concubines to his retinue in the manner of Darius, in number not less than the days of the year, and outstanding in beauty, as selected from all the women of Asia. Each night these paraded about the couch of the king so that he might select the one with whom he would lie that night. Alexander, as a matter of fact, employed these customs rather sparingly and kept for the most part his accustomed routine, not wishing to offend the Macedonians. That's a very telling addition by Diodorus, that whatever ceremony Alexander did adopt was largely for the benefit of his Persian subjects. And he did it sparingly for the benefit of those Persians, and did not insist that his Macedonians follow the routines. And that's a point to stress. And this apparently characterized Alexander's behavior throughout the later stages of the expedition in Iran, from 330 to 325 BC, from 330 to 327 BC, and then again in India in the 2 to 3 years where he was campaigning along the Indus Valley and its tributaries. Rufus dwells upon the drink of Alexander. He's drawing on an old tradition that goes back to Alexander's lifetime, the noble conqueror done in by too much alcohol. And this is what Rufus has to say. Alexander had some great natural gifts, a noble disposition surpassing that of all other monarchs, resolution in the face of danger, speed in undertaking and completing projects, integrity in dealing with those who surrendered, and mercy towards prisoners. Restraint even in those pleasures which are generally acceptable and widely indulged. High praise indeed from Curtius Rufus, who is by inclination a Roman Stoic. But all of these were marred by his inexcusable fondness for drink. At the very time that his enemy and rival for imperial power was preparing to resume hostilities. That's a very vague phrase. Apparently that's Darius III. And when the conquered nations, only recently subdued, still had scant respect for his authority, he was attending daytime drinking parties at which women were present, not indeed such women as it was a crime to violate, but courtesans, that is the hetairae of Greek tradition, who had been leading disreputable lives with the soldiers. Again, Rufus is thinking a great deal of the indulgences of the Roman court, as well as the Roman court, especially of Nero, perhaps of Domitian, more likely Nero, and also is drawing upon this earlier tradition. Yet both of these sources stress an important fact, and that is Alexander indulged in these rituals and these events to win over his Persians. As for the drinking habits, Plutarch goes out of his way to dispel these claims at a number of points in the biography, simply insisting that Alexander really lingered over his drinking, and he didn't drink as much as one would think, that he actually drank rather sparingly, and it was just bad manners not to hold these symposia, these drinking assemblies of the Macedonian nobility, which was a tradition. And in Central Asia particularly, and probably in Iran as well, it was not advisable to drink the water. And especially in winter campaigns, in the autumn campaigns and in the winter quarters, the army indulged in a great deal of wine drinking because the water could give rise to dysentery. And we have a number of reports of that in the accounts. So you have to take these comments by Rufus in their context. There were 2 points, however, that the Macedonians might have found objectionable. And that was the fact that Alexander, since his visit to Siwa, increasingly had a sense that he was a son of Zeus, that he had divine favor, and that divinity implied a rejection of Philip. That would be very difficult for the older Macedonians to accept. Some of the younger Macedonians might not have been as disturbed, but in general, the Macedonians had a great reverence for the Argead house, and that included Philip of Macedon, who had essentially made them what they were. And so these comparisons to Heracles and Achilles were fine, but if it went too far and led Alexander essentially to reject his father and his paternity, this would cause a great deal of resentment among Macedonians. The second point is, after Alexander crossed the Tigris in 330 BC, he had an enormous amount of money. He was hiring large numbers of Greek mercenaries, and I mentioned that the army increased to its largest size in Central Asia, in Bactrian Sogdiana. But there were others flocking to the court to get in on the largesse, and those included many savants, philosophers, self-proclaimed intellectuals who clustered around Alexander, and Plutarch has a very good sense from his sources of all of these hanger-ons and parasites and flatterers who began to fill up the court and sang the praises of Alexander and made all sorts of comparisons, some of them absolutely outrageous, at these drinking parties. This became offensive to both the Macedonians and the Greeks, and some may have found the atmosphere at court at times quite oppressive. And Plutarch has a good sense of what this must have been like. He's living in the Roman age, and he understands how courts can become tediously oppressive when the monarch gets too full of himself. So these two forces were working away and causing a certain amount of resentment within the army. Some scholars have read this resentment and opposition in a a rather sinister light. One view, argued by a very distinguished professor, who's probably one of the great experts on Alexander of our generation, Ernst Bading at Harvard, goes so far as to see these three incidents as part of a wider effort by Alexander, rather than by his critics, to remove opposition and make Alexander a secure autocrat. And that all of these events were really masterminded. In the case of the first one by Philotas, Philotas was essentially framed by Alexander in order to remove nobles who were a potential danger to the throne. Such a reading of the sources requires Alexander to be engaged in constant scheming to do in his nobility, and really it really goes against a lot of the sources, and also requires a lot of assumptions about deaths due to illness or the disappearance of figures in the sources as somehow a diabolical removal of a potential rival or a member of the circle of Parmenio or some other group. And that's just going too far. The campaign was arduous. Many of the officers died of illness and disease, including one of Parmenio's sons, the commander of the Hypaspists, Conus, who spoke against Alexander in India. He died of illness afterwards. There's no reason to believe foul play and a concerted effort to remove the officers. Far from it. Alexander was attempting to keep his officers together. He knew they were all ambitious. There were rivalries among them, and he had to make sure that he got the best out of his men because only Macedonian nobles could command the army. Another view is to see these conspiracies as contributing to the megalomania of Alexander, so by the time he enters India, he is simply a tyrant and a precursor to almost a Hitlerian figure. I think all of these views go too far, and it's best to look at the three incidents that have come down to the sources and make a judgment on which each of them means, rather than to link them together in some kind of grand scheme. The first occurred in late 330 BC, shortly after Iran had been essentially conquered. And it occurred in the town known as Frada, which is today in southwestern Afghanistan in the Helmand Valley, and actually was to be the winter quarters of that year. Philotas was commander of the companion cavalry. His father at this point was in command of the rear forces at Ekbatana, that is the treasury, and a very large army of mercenaries in northwestern Iran, that is Media. Philotas apparently had a long-standing rivalry with two leading figures at court. One was Craterus, the most talented commander of the phalanx, who had on his payroll Philotas's mistress, Antigone, who told Craterus all sorts of incidents, apparently, in which Philotas boasted about his prowess and in some ways diminished Alexander. The other was Hephaestion, who was the best friend of Alexander, and Craterus and Hephaestion later did not play well together, but nonetheless, they would agree in their dislike of Philotas, who had command of the cavalry as well as, to a large extent, the correspondence of the king. It was brought to Philotas's attention that there was a conspiracy afoot by a fellow named Dimnus, Macedonian, and Dimnus had confided this in his lover, Neomachus. Neomachus was aghast at the thought that Dimnus was plotting the execution of the king, or the murder of the king. He confided it to his older brother, Sabellinus. The two brothers were really aghast at what to do. They brought the information to Philotas. Philotas listened to the brothers and decided that it was not an important incident, that it was a lot of talk on the part of Dimnus, and didn't proceed further. Furthermore, Philotas actually had a meeting with Alexander and failed to bring this up. Well, the brothers became quite impatient, and they went to Alexander directly and divulged the information. Immediately, there was a scandal at the court. Hephaestion and Craterus came out of the woodwork, made all sorts of accusations that Philotas had long been involved in conspiring or boasting, and the result was Philotas was put on trial. There are varying accounts of what happened at the trial. Arrian gives essentially the official version of events. Plutarch and Diodorus Siculus add in some incidents that Dimnus was tortured, that Philotas was even put under torture or pressed with questioning. Philotas never admitted to any kind of complicity in the conspiracy. At the most, he had failed to inform the conspiracy, to inform the king about the conspiracy, but that was enough. Many of the senior officers, including men such as Kenneth, one of the talented commanders in the phalanx who eventually rose to high position in Central Asia and India and was married to Philotas' sister, they were all upset about this. And it wasn't just to preserve their own careers that they had a link to Philotas. The murder of the king would have put the entire expedition in jeopardy, and Philotas had failed in his mission. So many of the senior officers really believed that some kind of action had to be taken. The sources all seem to agree that Alexander really debated whether Philotas should be put on trial and executed. Dimnus was clearly executed. The conspiracy resulted also in the execution of several other individuals. One was a member of the bodyguard of Alexander who was apparently implicated earlier in some kind of conspiracy. His name was Demetrius. Another was Alexander the Lancastrian, who was a potential rival to Alexander. He had been under house arrest since the beginning of the expedition. There were letters implicating him in a plot that had been uncovered by Parmenio. These two men suffered execution. Four brothers, who were very important in the command of the phalanx, were also put on trial but acquitted. There was no evidence. What we have is information from the sources that fundamentally only four people were executed. Two who were considered problems from earlier plots who were under arrest. Dimnus, who was behind the original scheme of the murder, and we don't know of any others, and finally Philotas himself. Curtius Rufus tells us that Philotas was put on trial before the assembly of the Macedonian army, and he used that occasion to denounce Alexander's policies, particularly those policies I had read in the previous passage by Diodorus Siculus, that is, Alexander's adoption of Persian dress and winning over the Persians. In the fall of 330 BC, Alexander would have only been in the early stages of doing this, and it was a new policy, and it was bringing in results. A number of important Persian nobles had come over to Alexander. Some of them had been trusted with satrapies. And as Curtius himself admits, Alexander was rather sparing in the use of this Persian ritual, and no Persian aristocrat was ever put in charge of armed forces or money. That was strictly in the hands of Macedonians, or in a few instances of very, very loyal Greek mercenary officers and accountants. So we're not sure if this speech by Curtius Rufus is real or not, that it could have been to some extent invented by him and his sources as something appropriate, as an occasion in which Philotas, now put on trial, would use the opportunity to denounce Alexander's so-called orientalizing policies, an old-fashioned term that is a little bit dated but usually used to designate Alexander's adoption of Persian ceremonial and the winning over of the Iranian nobility. In any event, his execution was voted as a legal act, and he was executed in the traditional Macedonian fashion, the equivalent of a firing squad, that is, he was hit by a group of javelin men. Alexander, if we believe the sources, particularly Plutarch on this, was very reluctant to execute Philotas. He considered giving clemency to Philotas, that is, forgiving him, of course, stripping him of command, and command of the companion cavalry was henceforth divided between Hephaestion and Clytus, son of Dropides, that is, Clytus the Black, the man who had distinguished himself at the Battle of the Granicus by saving Alexander's life. However, Hephaestion, Craterus, and other officers pressed Alexander that it was too dangerous, that Philotas had really failed in his duty, had put Alexander and the entire expedition in jeopardy. Reluctantly, if you believe Plutarch and Arrian, Alexander ordered the execution. And I do believe that reluctance was probably real. It was not a put-on by Alexander. He knew that in executing Philotas, there would be the problem of the father, Parmenio. At that moment, Parmenio was at Ecbatana in northwestern Iran, Media, and he held open the communications west through Asia Minor to Macedon. He also had an enormous amount of money, and at his command were some of the best veteran mercenary units in the Macedonian army. In fact, it was a good deal of the cavalry that had fought on the right flank guard at the Battle of Gaugamela. included seasoned commanders such as Menidas and the Thracian commander Sitalkes. As a result, Alexander was forced, and given the many have seen this as a blot on his career, but given the rough politics of the Macedonian court, he really had no choice. He sent a message to those commanders in Ecbatana to execute Parmenio, and Parmenio was lured into a compromising position and cut down, and the order was carried out. This is perhaps best described as judicial murder. The Macedonian Assembly at Frada, which was then renamed as Prophthasia, which in Greek means foresight, that is the foresight of overcoming a conspiracy. The Macedonian Assembly had voted this, and Alexander had in some ways assuaged his conscience for this ignoble act. Really had very little choice. Parmenio could well have decided to avenge his son. There could have been all sorts of trouble in the backfield, the lines of communications. And it was an unfortunate and ignominious way for Parmenio to end his life. He had fought with great courage. Some would go so far as to say he was by far the best commander in Alexander's army, and even some would argue that it was Parmenio rather than Alexander who was winning the battles. That's going a bit too far. Nonetheless, the events certainly did not encourage or promote the morale within the army. It was a very ugly way of ending a successful campaigning season. However, it is difficult to see some kind of frame or widespread effort on Alexander to remove the nobility. The number of victims were actually very few. The second incident involved Clitus, the son of Dropides, or as he's known in the sources, Clitus the Black. This occurred in the winter quarters in Central Asia during the heavy drinking, probably in 328 BC. And you have to put it in its context. They're in Sogdiana. They've been long isolated from the Mediterranean world. The fighting had been brutal. At one of those all-night drinking parties, traditional in the Macedonian house, the Greeks were praising Alexander. There were philosophers and poets. They were singing in honor of Alexander, and in some ways actually diminished the courage of one of the Macedonian columns that had been defeated. That is, that column that had gone down fighting in 329 BC against Spitamenes. And as the drinking went on, and as the Greek sycophants increasingly extolled Alexander, Clitus got extremely angry. He got very drunk, and the wine loosened his tongue, and he began to object to this and reminded Alexander that none of this would have been possible without Clitus, because he had saved Alexander at the Granicus. Alexander got very angry. He called out to his guard in Macedonian to arrest him, to arrest Clitus. They refused to respond. Clitus's friends got him out of the tent. Alexander was restrained by his friends. They were attempting to break up two men who were just too drunk and befuddled to really hold any kind of conversation. They were actually talking around or over each other rather than to each other. Unfortunately, Clitus could not be restrained. He got up from his tent and wandered back into the royal tent, came in unexpectedly, and then quoted a phrase from Euripides' Andromache, "Alas, what evil customs reign in Greece," referring to Alexander's policies of winning over the Persians, and the Greek word there is nomos, law or custom. Alexander, in a rage, grabbed a spear and ran Clitus through. At that point, sobriety returned. Alexander was shocked at what he did. He dropped to the floor. He was overcome by grief and actually went into his tent for 3 days in remorse. Now, some would argue that this was all, again, a conceit by Alexander, a very carefully staged drama to remove a noble who had gotten in the way of Alexander's authority. And there's no way to really answer that charge, except that the sources don't see it that way, that many of the Macedonians at the drinking party had approved Clitus's criticism, and Curtius adds the detail that Clitus even praised Parmenio in the course of reminding Alexander of Clitus's own bravery at the Granicus. But whatever happened, and whatever was recalled the next morning after that drunken party, which was typical of the Macedonian court, it seems that at most Alexander should be accused of manslaughter rather than some kind of premeditated murder. The grief seems to have been genuine. Alexander, in many ways, was imitating his ancestor Achilles, who would go into his tent out of grief. The Greek word for this would have been ate, that is the moral blindness sent upon someone. And that's really very convenient for explaining any kind of irrational actions in the ancient world. You simply say ate was sent by Zeus. That's how Agamemnon makes his apology to Achilles in the Iliad, and everyone agrees to this. And there was an understanding that there was a highly irrational side to humans as well as an intellectual, and I think it's just going too far to think that this was some sort of clever rage contrived by Alexander to kill Clitus. It was a very unfortunate and ugly incident in which tempers were flared and in which Alexander found himself actually acting quite out of character and in some ways like his father. Philip came close to killing Alexander over that wedding ceremony celebrating Philip's marriage to Cleopatra. So the incident isn't all that unusual at the Macedonian court. Some months later, in 327 BC, there was a final incident, and this did not involve the Macedonians. It involved a Greek. It involved Callisthenes, the official historian. And that was a result of Callisthenes' objection to one of those ceremonies being introduced to the court, and this was a new ceremony, and it's known as proskynesis. It's difficult to know what proskynesis was. There apparently were several different ways of performing this ceremony, and that was, one was to prostrate yourself before someone who was of higher authority and rank. This would be an honor that to the Greeks and Macedonians belonged only to a god, whereas in Persia it was good manners before the great king. The other would be exchange of kisses on the cheek. These would be of people of closer rank. This is still a ceremony that is accepted in the Middle East today. Whatever the type of ceremony, certainly the nobles would exchange a kiss with Alexander. Others would be expected to prostrate themselves. Well, Callisthenes, Alexander thought, was in favor of this ceremony as a way of uniting the court, the Iranians, the Greeks, the Macedonians. But when it came time to perform the ceremony, and a cup of wine was exchanged, essentially a love cup, and the various Macedonian nobles were to receive their kiss from Alexander, Hephaestion and others went up to do so. Callisthenes refused to perform the ceremony, and Alexander got very, very resentful, and Callisthenes simply said, well, I leave the event a kiss poorer, big deal. Now, Callisthenes spoke out in a way that no Macedonian would have. Many of the Greeks and Macedonians probably approved of Callisthenes' objection. In any event, it marked Callisthenes for destruction. And Plutarch understood this. Plutarch noted that Callisthenes, in many ways, had prevented Alexander from demanding a ceremony that would have been degrading to the Greeks and Macedonians, and in so doing did a great service to Alexander. Because after that incident, Alexander dropped the notion of proskynesis. He never attempted to revive it. It was just too touchy an issue, and it implied adoration of Alexander as a god. Greeks and Macedonians would not do this. The most they could accept would be divine honors on Alexander's death as a result of his deeds. But worship in his lifetime, no. Greeks and Macedonians were not about to perform this. Shortly after this ceremony, there was a conspiracy among the pages, that is, the royal pages, the young men being trained to go into the cavalry. These would be adolescents. Hermolaos, one of these pages, had been apparently publicly punished by Alexander for a misdeed. He had been whipped and humiliated before the other pages, and he conspired with some pages to murder the king. Well, this information was quickly divulged to Alexander, and Callisthenes was arrested and enchained. The argument was that he was the instructor of these pages, and these sort of incidents in history always make me very nervous, like the trial of Socrates. A teacher is always held responsible for the action of his students, and I don't sleep easily on some evenings when I consider some of the students in my career. In any case, Callisthenes was arrested. He was not tried. He was not executed. We think he, at this point, was a citizen of Athens, and so he ended a miserable life in captivity, and we have various reports on his death. He died because of abuse. He was filled with lice. He was dragged around chained, or he was put in a cage. There's all sorts of sensational stories. Whatever happened, he apparently died in captivity without ever being put on trial. It was a miserable end for Callisthenes, yet Callisthenes had won an important point. He had forced Alexander to back off on the whole ceremony of proskynesis. That was the final incident that occurred just before the invasion of India. All three of these incidents do point out tensions within the Macedonian army, and this would be expected once the army had crossed the Tigris and had entered Iran and Central Asia. It was very far removed from its homeland. The fighting in Central Asia, the bleak winters, the landscapes, the guerrilla warfare contributed to the tensions. Alexander's policy to win over the Persians, of course, would cause some kind of resentment within the army. They had just defeated these people. Why are they being exalted at court? Nonetheless, it is to go too far in reading that Alexander used this resentment, this opposition, as a way to crush any critic, legitimate or imagined, in order to exalt his autocracy. It is also difficult to argue that there was widespread resentment and anger towards Alexander, and that many of the Macedonians were ready to go against their king. Far from it. In my opinion, in the spring of 327 BC, when Alexander's army marched over the Hindu Kush once more, they marched into India in high spirits. For them, they thought that their king was leading them to the edge of the world, that is, to the great Eastern Ocean, and soon they would be returning home.